Imagine being haunted by shadows that you can't explain, since you were just a child. Shadows that never leave, even after years of medication and therapy. Welcome to a story that blurs the line between reality and nightmare, where fear is more than just a feeling. It's a constant companion. From the age of 4, Lucas has lived a life plagued by visions that defy logic. This is not a story made for the faint of heart. It is a chilling account of a young man whose grip on reality was fractured by something lurking in the dark corners of his room. He grew up fearing the night, and even now, at 20 years old, he still doesn't sleep without the lights on. What follows is his terrifying journey into the unknown. A journey that began with a shadow at his bedroom door, a shadow with eyes like black holes, and a silhouette that seemed to mock his helplessness. In this video, we will follow Lucas's story from the moment his reality first started to crumble. His earliest memory is waking up in the middle of the night, paralyzed by an inexplicable fear. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from a bad dream. It was a cold, biting dread that seeped into his bones. He looked towards his bedroom door, and there he saw it. A man, dark as the shadows that surrounded him, wearing a hat that cast an even darker veil over his face. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, but stood there watching. Even at that young age, Lucas knew something was deeply wrong. He screamed until his voice cracked, and though his parents rushed to comfort him, they couldn't see what he saw. They turned on the lights, and the figure disappeared, leaving only doubt and disbelief. This story is more than a recounting of an encounter with the supernatural. It is a glimpse into the relentless terror that became Lucas's life. The fear that began that night would grow, feeding on his loneliness and his parents' dismissals. Over the years, Lucas's nightmares only deepened. He learned to fear the silence of the night, the creak of the floorboards, and even his own reflection in the dark. Every noise became a possible warning of the figure's return, every shadow a reminder that the darkness was never empty. And yet, despite all the years that have passed, Lucas's fear has never truly left. It clings to him like a second skin, whispering that the shadow is still out there, waiting. Tonight, you will hear Lucas's story, and perhaps you too will begin to question the reality of the darkness that surrounds you. If you're fascinated by real encounters with the paranormal, by stories where the terror isn't just in the mind, but seems to seep from the walls themselves, then this video is for you. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Sinister Stories, and share it with those who dare to confront the inexplicable. Because as you'll soon discover, sometimes the worst fears are the ones you cannot see, but can always feel, watching from just beyond the light. The story unfolds in a house that seems to have a life of its own, a house that creaks and groans as if whispering secrets to those who dare to listen. Imagine an old 2-story building, its wooden structure aged by time, where every step taken on its floorboards releases a long, eerie groan that echoes down the hallways. The air inside is thick, carrying the scent of damp wood, and something else, something metallic, like rust or perhaps blood. The walls are adorned with fading wallpaper, peeling at the edges as if trying to escape from something that hides within. It's a place that wears its history openly, each scar on the wall telling a story of times long past, of people who may have lived here and things that perhaps still do. Lucas's room is on the 2nd floor, at the end of a narrow hallway that seems to stretch further in the dark, like a path leading into a void. The door to his room is old, painted white, though time has stained it a sickly yellow. It creaks loudly when opened, and the hinges seem to sigh in protest whenever anyone passes through. Inside the room, there's a small bed pushed against the far wall, a single window with heavy curtains that rarely let the sunlight in, and a closet that stands ominously in the corner. It's a place that feels safe in daylight, where the warmth of the sun filters in just enough to chase away the shadows. But when the sun sets, the atmosphere changes entirely. The room feels colder, and the shadows that were once harmless grow, stretching across the floor like dark fingers creeping toward the bed. It was here, in this room, that Lucas first encountered the figure, a dark silhouette framed against the lightless hallway beyond his door. He would often wake in the dead of night to an unnatural stillness, a silence so heavy that it felt as though the house itself was holding its breath. There was something about the way the darkness settled into the corners of the room, something unnatural, as if it were hiding things that shouldn't be there. One particular night, the air turned icy without warning. Lucas awoke with a start, his breath visible in the frigid air. The feeling was unmistakable. He wasn't alone. His eyes slowly adjusted to the dark, and that's where he saw it. The figure of a man, standing just inside the doorway, entirely black, his form blending with the shadows except for his eyes. Dark, hollow eyes that seemed to absorb all the light around them. The hallway behind the figure appeared to stretch on into an abyss, an endless void that seemed to reach out for Lucas. The figure never moved, but its presence filled the room, suffocating him with an inexplicable dread. The sense of wrongness was overwhelming, a visceral reaction that made every hair on his body stand on end. It felt like the air itself was watching him, like something ancient and malevolent had found him and had no intention of leaving. The longer Lucas stared, the more the shadows seemed to shift, swirling around the figure like a living shroud, obscuring its form and yet making it all the more terrifying. He wanted to scream, but his voice was caught in his throat, as if the very presence of the figure had stolen it from him. The house itself seemed complicit in his terror. The walls groaned softly, the floorboards creaked as if something unseen was moving closer, and the closet door, which was always closed, now hung slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. It was as if the entire house was in on the nightmare, feeding on Lucas's fear, amplifying every sound, every flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. The shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, growing and shifting whenever he blinked, until it felt like they were only inches away. The sense of being watched was unbearable, a cold, sinking feeling that made him want to hide, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. This was his home, and whatever was haunting him knew it as well as he did. The first signs that something was wrong in Lucas's life were so subtle, so seemingly harmless, that they could have easily been dismissed as tricks of the mind. It began with sounds, a quiet tapping against the window, like fingernails rapping on the glass, but only when the night was at its darkest. At first, Lucas thought it was just the wind, perhaps a branch brushing against the side of the house. But there was a rhythm to it, an unnatural precision that hinted at something deliberate. The tapping always came at the same time, 3:03 a.m., as if something was trying to make itself known, just when the world was most silent and vulnerable. Then came the whispers. Lucas would lie in bed, drifting on the edge of sleep, when he'd hear them, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. They were never clear enough to understand, but their tone was unmistakably menacing, a sibilant chorus that rose and fell like the ebb of a dark tide. He'd strain to listen, heart pounding in his chest, convinced that if he could just catch a single word, he might understand what was happening. But the more he listened, the less human they seemed, as though the voices were speaking from deep within the walls, in a language that no living person should ever understand. The temperature in his room began to change unpredictably. Some nights, a sudden chill would envelop the space, so cold that his breath misted in front of him, and the air would feel heavy, pressing down on him like an unseen weight. Other nights, the room would grow oppressively warm, as if the very walls were exuding heat, making it impossible to breathe. The strange changes in temperature seemed to follow no pattern, but Lucas began to notice that the cold often preceded the appearance of the figure in the doorway, the dark man with the hat, his face always hidden, his presence like a void that consumed all light and warmth. The sense of being watched was the worst of it. It started as a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a feeling that someone or something was observing him from the shadows. He would turn, expecting to see his mother or father standing in the doorway, but there was never anyone there. The sensation grew stronger each night, until he could hardly sleep, too afraid to close his eyes. When he finally did drift off, he'd often wake suddenly, his heart pounding, convinced that someone was standing over him, staring. The room would be empty, of course, but the feeling lingered, as if invisible eyes had left an imprint on his very soul. One night, as Lucas lay in bed, he heard something different, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. They were heavy, the kind of steps that seemed to reverberate deep within the house, causing the floorboards to groan under the weight of something far heavier than a person should be. The steps moved closer, and Lucas's heart raced as he stared at the door, waiting, dreading what might come. The handle turned slightly, a metallic click that echoed through the silence. He pulled the covers up to his chin, his breath caught in his throat, unable to scream, unable to move. The door opened just a crack, enough to reveal the pitch-black darkness beyond, and there, standing in the shadows, was the figure once more. The man with the hat. His outline was sharp against the darkness, his presence unmistakable. Lucas could see no eyes, no features, only the oppressive void where his face should be. He blinked, and for a split second, he thought he saw something move within the darkness of the figure's face, an impression of teeth, sharp and glistening, as if the void itself were grinning at him. A cold terror washed over Lucas, more profound than anything he had ever felt. It was not just fear of the unknown. It was a primal, bone-deep horror, an instinctive understanding that whatever stood in his doorway did not belong to this world. Lucas could feel the figure watching him, though it had no eyes. The sensation was suffocating, a pressure that grew until he felt as though his very soul was being pulled toward that dark silhouette. The air seemed to hum with a low, droning sound, like a distant echo of something terrible, vibrating through the walls and through Lucas's bones. He wanted to scream, to call for his parents, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the figure had taken his voice, leaving him powerless, a prisoner in his own bed. The room seemed to close in on itself, the walls bending, the ceiling dropping, and Lucas felt as if he were being swallowed by the darkness that emanated from the figure. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The figure stepped back, melting into the shadows of the hallway, the door creaking shut behind it. The air returned to normal, the pressure lifting, and Lucas could finally breathe again. He gasped, tears streaming down his face, and for a long while, he just lay there, staring at the door, terrified that it might open again. He knew now that whatever haunted his nights was no mere figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was not going away. It wanted something from him, something that he could neither understand nor escape. Lucas found himself living in constant fear, but what terrified him more than the shadowy figure was the growing feeling that he was slowly losing control over his own mind. Night after night, he was faced with the choice. Should he confront whatever it was that haunted his life, or should he continue to hide, hoping that if he ignored it long enough, it would simply go away? Each day, the thought of facing it gnawed at him, filling him with both terror and a desperate, inexplicable curiosity. The shadows seemed to taunt him, lingering just out of reach, daring him to step into the unknown. One evening, as Lucas sat on the edge of his bed, the air felt thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your heart beat faster for reasons you can't fully understand. He knew the figure would come again tonight. He could feel it deep in his bones. It was as though the darkness itself had communicated with him, a silent whisper from the void that had promised its return. Lucas had had enough. He was tired of the sleepless nights, the cold terror that never seemed to leave, the way his parents looked at him like he was just a scared child with an overactive imagination. He needed to know the truth, and he needed to face it, whatever it was. He resolved that tonight he wouldn't look away. He would confront the darkness. The night crept in slowly, the sunset's last orange rays giving way to a cold blue, and then to black. The house was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The ticking of the old clock in the hallway sounded louder, each second a countdown to something terrible. Lucas sat on his bed, the only light coming from a dim lamp on his nightstand. He kept his eyes on the door, waiting, listening to the silence that pressed in from every corner of the room. The minutes dragged on, the atmosphere in the room growing colder, until the temperature dropped so suddenly that he could see his breath again, fogging in front of him like a ghostly whisper. The moment came just after midnight. The handle of his door turned slowly, the metallic click echoing in the stillness. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse thundering in his ears as the door creaked open. The hallway beyond was pitch black, an inky void that seemed to swallow the light from his room. And then there it was, standing in the doorway, the figure with the hat. Its outline was as sharp and menacing as ever, and the shadows around it seemed to writhe, as though they were alive, a living shroud that wrapped itself around the dark man. Lucas's instinct screamed at him to look away, to pull the covers over his head and pretend it wasn't there, but he fought against the urge. He forced himself to hold its gaze, to stare into the void where its eyes should be. The figure didn't move, but the sensation of being watched was so powerful that it felt like a physical force, pressing down on Lucas's chest, making it difficult to breathe. He could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that sank deep into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. And then something changed. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if acknowledging Lucas's defiance. A deep, echoing voice filled the room, not spoken aloud, but inside Lucas's mind, a whisper that reverberated through his skull, filling every corner of his thoughts. "Why do you look?" it asked, the words dripping with malice, as if the very act of staring at it was an unforgivable sin. Lucas wanted to respond, but his mouth wouldn't move, his voice still caught somewhere in his throat. All he could do was watch as the figure took step forward, its presence growing larger, more oppressive, the darkness seeming to pulse and throb around it. Fear surged through Lucas, but with it came a strange sense of clarity. This was it. This was the confrontation he'd been waiting for, the moment that would determine whether he could take back control of his life, or if he would be forever lost to the terror that haunted him. The figure raised one arm, and for the first time, Lucas saw its hand, a twisted, blackened thing, fingers unnaturally long and ending in sharp, claw-like tips. It reached towards him, the air growing impossibly cold, the shadows closing in until all Lucas could see was darkness. Lucas clenched his fists, a surge of defiance rising within him. He wasn't going to let it take him. He forced himself to speak, to break through the paralysis that had gripped him for so long. "What do you want?" he managed to choke out, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure paused, its outstretched hand hovering inches from his face. For a long moment, there was only silence, the kind that presses down on you, making every breath a struggle. And then, the figure's head tilted again, and the void where its eyes should be seemed to deepen, a swirling darkness that pulled at Lucas's very soul. "You?" The word echoed in his mind, a single, chilling answer that carried with it a weight of inevitability. The shadows seemed to swell, enveloping Lucas entirely, the cold searing through him, and for a terrifying moment, he felt as though he was falling, plummeting into an endless void. He fought against it, clinging desperately to the last shred of light, to the hope that he could still break free. He squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face, and screamed. A raw, primal scream that shattered the silence, reverberating through the room. Suddenly, the cold was gone, the shadows receded, and when Lucas opened his eyes, the figure was no longer there. The door was closed, the air still, the only sound the pounding of his own heart. He collapsed back onto the bed, exhausted, his body trembling. He had faced the darkness, and though he had not defeated it, he had survived. But deep down, he knew that this was far from over. The figure would return, and the next time, it might not be so easily driven away. The night of confrontation arrived, more oppressive than any before. Lucas felt a dark certainty that the shadows were not just waiting for him, but that they had grown restless, hungry. The house had never been so quiet, as if holding its breath, anticipating something horrific. Lucas sat alone in his room, the single dim lamp casting trembling shadows along the walls. Outside his window, the night was thick and starless, a blanket of darkness that seemed to press in, suffocating any chance of light or hope. He knew the figure would come. It was only a matter of time. The chill arrived first, as it always did, a sudden drop in temperature that made Lucas's breath cloud before his face, the warmth leaching out of the air. The lamp flickered, its weak light struggling against the darkness that now gathered at the corners of the room. Lucas's heart pounded, a steady, frantic rhythm that echoed in his ears. He could feel it, the heaviness in the air, the invisible eyes watching, the sense that something ancient and malicious was closing in. Then came the sound, a slow, deliberate creak from the hallway, like someone or something was approaching, each step purposeful, filled with intent. The door to his room opened slowly, without a sound, revealing the darkness beyond. Lucas's eyes widened, his body frozen as the familiar silhouette emerged from the void. The figure with the hat stood there, black as pitch, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows that clung to it. But tonight, there was something different, something more menacing about its presence. The darkness seemed to move around it, a swirling mist that pulsed and writhed, as if alive. The figure took a step forward, and Lucas felt his heart drop, a cold dread washing over him, paralyzing him to the core. The figure moved into the room, each step deliberate, as if savoring Lucas's fear. Its hat cast an even deeper shadow over its face, concealing any features. But Lucas knew it was staring at him. He could feel the weight of its gaze, a suffocating pressure that pinned him to the bed. He wanted to scream, to move, but his body refused to obey, as though the shadows themselves had wrapped around him, holding him in place. The air seemed to throb with a low, droning hum, a sound that resonated deep within Lucas, vibrating through his bones, threatening to shake him apart. The figure raised one hand, long, thin fingers extending, almost skeletal, their tips ending in sharp, jagged points. Lucas's eyes followed the movement, his breath hitching in his throat as the hand reached out towards him, closer and closer, until he could feel the chill radiating from it. The darkness around the figure seemed to thicken, coalescing, and for a brief moment, Lucas could see something within it. Faces, twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. The sight was so horrifying that Lucas had to close his eyes, tears streaming down his face, every part of him screaming to wake up from this nightmare that had no end. A voice filled the room, not spoken aloud, but in Lucas's mind, a deep, echoing whisper that seemed to come from the depths of the void. "Look at me," it said, the words resonating with an unnatural power, a command that Lucas felt in every fiber of his being. He opened his eyes, and for the first time, he saw what lay beneath the hat. It was not a face. There was no flesh, no eyes, only a swirling mass of darkness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. And within that void, there was movement, something shifting, something alive. It felt as though the darkness itself was reaching out to him, trying to pull him in. Lucas felt the pull, an invisible force drawing him closer to the figure, the darkness stretching, wrapping around him like tendrils. His vision blurred, the edges of the room fading as the void consumed everything. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that overlapped, each one dripping with malice, each one promising pain, suffering, and despair. Lucas's body trembled, his heart racing, but deep within him, something stirred, a spark of defiance, a refusal to be taken by whatever this was. He focused on that spark, clinging to it, trying to push back against the suffocating darkness. With every ounce of strength he had, Lucas forced his arm to move. He reached out, his hand trembling, towards the lamp on his nightstand. The figure seemed to sense his intent, and the shadows swelled, the cold deepening until it felt as though his bones would shatter from the sheer chill. But Lucas pushed through the fear, his fingers brushing against the lamp. He knocked it over, the bulb shattering with a sharp crack, and in that instant, a burst of light erupted, the brief flare enough to cut through the darkness. The figure recoiled, the shadows withdrawing, the void shrinking back towards the doorway. Lucas gasped for breath, his body collapsing against the bed as the oppressive weight lifted. He watched, his vision blurred by tears, as the figure faded into the hallway, the door closing behind it with a soft click. The cold lingered, but the darkness had lost its hold, the room slowly returning to a semblance of normality. Lucas lay there, his body trembling, exhaustion washing over him in waves. He had confronted the supernatural, and though he had survived, he knew this was not the end. The figure would return. It was only a matter of time. But tonight, Lucas had fought back, and for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The darkness was powerful, but it was not invincible. And as long as he could still fight, he would not let it take him. The following night, the air in Lucas's room was thick with tension, a dreadful, almost tangible anticipation of what was to come. He could feel the darkness pressing in from every corner, creeping across the floor like a living thing. This time, however, Lucas was ready. He sat in his bed, flashlight in hand, determined not to be taken by surprise again. The temperature dropped sharply, and the silence that followed was so profound that it seemed to swallow all sound, leaving only the frantic pounding of his heart. The door opened slowly, without a creak this time, as if the darkness had learned how to move silently. The hallway beyond was nothing but an endless black void, and then, stepping out of that void, the figure emerged. It was taller now, more defined, as though feeding on Lucas's fear had given it more substance. The hat cast its shadow, but there was no longer a question about what lay beneath it. A swirling, chaotic darkness, a void that felt like it could consume the world. Lucas could see the movement inside it again, the faces twisted in expressions of agony, reaching towards him with silent screams. Lucas's body felt paralyzed, the air so cold that his skin ached. The figure moved closer, and with each step, the sense of despair deepened, an overwhelming feeling that there was no escape, no end to the nightmare. But as the figure approached, something changed. The whispers began again, that same low, insidious voice that echoed within Lucas's mind, demanding his submission. But this time, Lucas listened more closely, focusing on the words instead of the fear. There was something in them, something beneath the malice, a message, a hint at the truth behind this terror. The figure stopped at the edge of his bed, raising its hands slowly, fingers elongating into twisted, claw-like shapes. The void where its face should have been seen to ripple, the darkness parting for just a moment, revealing something deep within, a single, piercing eye, bloodshot and filled with hatred. It stared directly into Lucas's soul, and he felt the world around him begin to fade. The walls of his room seemed to melt away, the ceiling disappearing, until all that remained was the darkness and that terrible, unblinking eye. Then Lucas heard it, a voice, faint but distinct beneath the layers of whispers. It was a woman's voice, soft and desperate, calling out a name. Lucas. It was not the voice of the dark figure, nor was it a voice he recognized, but it was calling for him, pleading, as if reaching out from somewhere far away. The realization hit him with a sudden clarity. This entity, this figure, was not just an apparition or a hallucination. It was a cage, a prison holding something else inside, something that wanted to escape. The faces in the void, the twisted expressions, they weren't trying to frighten him. They were trying to warn him. The figure lunged forward, its hand reaching for Lucas's face, the void behind its eye expanding, swallowing everything in darkness. But Lucas, fueled by a newfound determination, switched on the flashlight, aiming the beam directly into the figure's eye. The light seemed to pierce the darkness, cutting through the void, and for an instant, Lucas saw it clearly. The dark man wasn't a man at all, but a collection of shadows, an amalgamation of hatred and fear, held together by something far more sinister. The faces within the void screamed silently, their expressions shifting from terror to hope, as though they had been waiting for this moment. The light from the flashlight grew brighter, almost blinding, and the figure let out a sound, an awful, guttural noise that echoed inside Lucas's mind, filled with rage and pain. The shadows began to unravel, the darkness peeling away like smoke caught in a sudden wind. The eye vanished, replaced by a swirling emptiness, and Lucas could feel the pressure lifting, the cold receding as the figure dissolved into nothingness. The light expanded, filling the room, pushing back the dark until, finally, it was gone. The door slammed shut, and Lucas was left alone, panting, his heart pounding in his ears, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. As Lucas sat there trying to catch his breath, he realized that the true horror had not been the figure itself, but what it represented, a manifestation of something beyond comprehension, a force that thrived on fear and despair, using it to grow stronger, to hold its captives within its endless void. The whispers, the faces, those had been the souls it had consumed, trapped within its darkness, yearning for freedom. And the voice that called his name, perhaps it had been someone who had once faced the same terror, who had tried to warn him before it was too late. The revelation was chilling. The dark man was not gone forever. It had merely been banished, its power broken, at least for now. But Lucas knew, deep down, that as long as fear existed, so too would the darkness. It was a part of the world, a part of him, and while he had won this battle, the war was far from over. The light from his flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness once more. Lucas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the truth settle over him. The dark man was still out there, waiting, but so was Lucas, ready for whatever came next. The days that followed the confrontation were a blur for Lucas, an exhausting mix of confusion, dread, and an unsettling sense of calm. The shadowy figure had disappeared, but its absence felt less like a victory and more like a prelude to something worse. The house no longer seemed as threatening, but there was an emptiness that lingered in every room, an echo of what had transpired. The creaking of the old floorboards was now an ever-present reminder that the house itself was aware of what had happened, a witness to the dark encounter between Lucas and the entity that had tried to consume him. Lucas tried to return to normal, but normal was no longer something he could grasp. Every night, he would lay in bed, staring at the door, waiting for the familiar chill to return, waiting for the door to creak open, and for the darkness to step inside once more. But the figure never came. Instead, there were moments, brief, unsettling moments, where Lucas could feel its presence. He would be brushing his teeth, staring into the bathroom mirror, and for a split second, he would see a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, a shadow that shouldn't be there. Or he would wake in the middle of the night, his skin prickling with an inexplicable sense of unease, as though someone were standing over him, watching. One night, Lucas awoke to a sound that made his blood run cold, a soft, slow tapping against the window, the same rhythmic knock he had heard so many times before. He turned his head, the hairs on his neck standing on end, his breath catching in his throat. There, beyond the window, in the darkness, was a figure, a silhouette against the night, the faint outline of a hat visible against the sky. Lucas's heart pounded, a terror more profound than any he had ever felt washing over him. He blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the rustling of leaves outside and the echo of his own frantic breathing. Lucas knew he had not imagined it. The entity was still there, lurking just beyond the boundaries of his vision, waiting for the right moment to return. The whispers had stopped. The shadows no longer shifted with malice, but the fear remained. He realized with a sinking feeling that this was the true nature of the horror he had faced. It was not a monster that could be defeated with light or courage. It was something far more insidious, something that thrived on his fear, his vulnerability, something that had become a part of him. He began to see the figure in his dreams, always standing at a distance, always watching. It never approached, never spoke, but its presence was enough to send Lucas waking in a cold sweat, his heart racing, the sense of dread overwhelming. He would look around his room, half expecting to see it standing in the doorway, but the room would be empty, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on his nightstand. The figure had left its mark, a scar on Lucas's mind that would never fully heal, a constant reminder that the darkness was always closer than he would like to believe. One evening, Lucas decided to leave his room and sleep on the couch in the living room. He thought maybe a change of scenery would help. that the memories of what had happened in his bedroom would fade if he put some distance between himself and that place. He lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to gather in the corners of the room. Sleep came slowly, a restless, uneasy slumber that offered no real rest. In the dead of night, he awoke again, a cold shiver running down his spine. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the curtains. And there, standing in the hallway, was the figure, the dark man, his hat casting a shadow over the featureless void of his face. It stood motionless, just watching, its presence filling the room with a cold that seemed to seep into Lucas's very bones. He wanted to scream, to move, but his body refused to obey, paralyzed by the sheer terror that gripped him. The figure lingered for what felt like an eternity, and then, just as silently as it had appeared, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the house. Lucas sat up, his body trembling, tears streaming down his face. He realized then that there was no escaping it. The dark man was not bound to his room, to the house. It was bound to him. It would follow him wherever he went, a silent, relentless presence that would haunt his every step. He could never be truly free, not from something that had rooted itself so deeply within his mind. The terror was not in the figure itself, but in the knowledge that it could come at any time, without warning, that it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reappear. Lucas tried to tell his parents again, but they looked at him with the same disbelief, the same pitying expressions they had always given him. They told him it was just a nightmare, that he needed to stop letting his imagination get the better of him. But Lucas knew better. He had seen the void, had felt the pull of the darkness, had heard the whispers of the lost souls trapped within. He knew that what he had faced was real, and that it was far from over. The story ends with Lucas sitting alone in his room, the flashlight clutched tightly in his hand, the light turned off but ready. He knew he could not banish the figure forever, but he could fight it, he could resist. And as long as he had the strength to keep the light on, to refuse the pull of the darkness, he would not let it take him. The shadows gathered once more at the edges of the room, the air growing colder, and Lucas took a deep breath, preparing himself for what he knew was coming. The dark man was still out there, waiting, but so was Lucas, and as long as he had a light, he would keep fighting. Lucas tried to go on with his life, trying to embrace a semblance of normality, but he knew he was irrevocably changed. Even in the daylight, when the warmth of the sun filled the rooms and chased away the shadows, he couldn't shake the sense of dread that clung to him like a second skin. The laughter of his parents, the cheerful conversations with friends, the mundane routines of everyday life, they all felt distant, like echoes of a world that he could no longer fully reach. He moved through his days with the weight of the darkness pressing on his shoulders, an invisible burden that no one else could see. He no longer slept in his bedroom. It remained closed, untouched, a relic of a time before the figure had taken over his life. Now, Lucas would sleep wherever he could find a sense of safety, sometimes on the couch, sometimes in the corner of the living room, the light left on to keep the darkness at bay. Yet, despite his efforts, he knew that safety was only an illusion. He had glimpsed the void, and he understood its power. There was no escaping it, only delaying the inevitable. The figure was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to slip back into his life. The most unsettling thing was how the presence seemed to invade his mind, even during the day. He would be sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his breakfast, and suddenly he would hear it. The soft tapping against the window, the sound that had haunted him for years. He would look up, expecting to see the figure standing outside, but there would be nothing, only the rustle of leaves in the breeze. And yet, the fear would remain, a cold, gnawing feeling deep in his gut, a certainty that he was never truly alone. Lucas started to notice other things, small but significant. The shadows seemed darker now, deeper, almost as if they were hiding something just out of sight. When he walked through the house at night, he could feel them shifting around him, moving just beyond the edge of his vision. He could hear whispers in the walls, faint and distant, like voices carried on the wind, calling his name. Sometimes, when he looked into a mirror, he would see a flicker of movement behind him, a flash of darkness that would vanish before he could fully turn to see it. The worst moments were when he saw the figure in his dreams. The dreams were always the same. He would find himself standing in a vast, empty place, a dark expanse that stretched out in all directions, featureless and cold. The ground beneath his feet would be nothing but shadows, shifting and writhing like a living sea, and somewhere in the distance, he would see it, the dark man standing there watching. It never moved, never spoke, but its presence was enough to fill him with a sense of hopelessness, a sinking dread that there was no escape. He would try to run, but his feet would sink into the shadowy ground, the darkness pulling him down, dragging him closer to the figure. In these dreams, the figure's face would change. Sometimes it was just a void, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. Other times, he would see glimpses of the faces he had seen in the void, twisted, agonized expressions, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with fear. They seemed to be pleading with him, begging for release, but there was nothing Lucas could do. The darkness would envelop him, the whispers growing louder, and he would wake, gasping for breath, the room around him cold and silent. Lucas knew that he could never return to the life he had before. The experience had altered something fundamental within him, something that could not be undone. He had seen the darkness, had faced the void, and he knew that it was not just a figment of his imagination. It was real, a force that existed beyond the boundaries of a known world, a malevolent presence that thrived on fear and despair, and had found him, marked him, and it would never truly leave. It was a part of him now, a shadow that would follow him for the rest of his life. He tried to explain it to his parents, to make them understand, but they only looked at him with pity, their eyes filled with concern. They thought he was sick, that his mind was playing tricks on him. They didn't understand, couldn't understand, and Lucas had stopped trying to make them see. He knew this was his burden to bear, his fight to face alone. The darkness was his, and only he could confront it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in twilight, Lucas stood at the window, staring out into the growing darkness. He could feel the chill in the air, the familiar sense of unease that came with the setting of the sun. He knew the dark man was still out there, waiting, but he also knew that he could not let it win. He had faced it before, had fought back, and he would continue to fight. He turned on the flashlight in his hand, the beam cutting through the gloom, and he felt a small spark of defiance ignite within him. The darkness might always be there, lurking in the corners of his vision, whispering to him from the shadows, but as long as he had the light, he would not give in. He would keep fighting, keep resisting, because the true terror was not in the darkness itself, but in surrendering to it. Lucas took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the flashlight, and he whispered to the night, his voice steady, filled with determination, "I'm not afraid of you." The wind rustled the leaves outside, and for a brief moment, Lucas thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard, a silhouette against the darkening sky. He stared at it unblinking, his heart pounding in his chest, and then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The shadows receded, the sense of dread lifting, and Lucas felt a strange calm settle over him. The dark man was still out there somewhere, but Lucas knew he was ready. The battle was far from over, but he would face it one night at a time, with the light as his weapon and his will as his shield.